Before we get into today's case, a big thanks to the sponsor of this video, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid is an epic online game which has completely taken over gaming, probably because it's one of the best mobile games around, maybe even the best. I've been playing Raid for a good while now, and it's just so engaging and enjoyable. There's countless tactics and champions to use and bosses to get through, so I'm always looking to level up and beat the competition. Also, the graphics are top notch, which makes it even more thrilling. This is especially true when it comes to bosses, and one of my favourites is Sagalaroth, Guardian of the Arcane Keep. He's not your typical Potion Keep boss, as he's tasked with protecting the arcane knowledge, and to prove your worth, you have to defeat him. This month, Raid's got a ton happening, including new bosses, exciting tournaments every single day, and even a legendary new champion. Now is the best time to get started in Raid, so make sure to click my link in the description or scan my QR code to get epic bonuses, including a free epic champion, Vergis, 200k silver, 1 energy refill, 1 XP boost, and 1 ancient shard. All this treasure will be waiting for you here, so don't miss out. Now, back to the video. Today we are looking at a case that took place in Burma, but today it would be considered Myanmar. So sit back as we go to the mid-20th century. Herman Perry was born into a poor African-American family in rural Monroe in North Carolina on the 16th of May 1922. His mother was named Flonnie Perry and was little more than a teenager at the time of Herman's birth. By way of contrast, his father, Fraudus Allsbrook, was several years older, but Herman would never know him as he took off and abandoned Flonnie immediately after Herman was born. Herman's early years were spent living in Monroe, but his and his mother's life changed for the better when the family moved to Washington, D.C. Here, as he entered his teenage years, he found work as a butcher's apprentice. He also became a father himself while still a teenager. However, things would soon change for Herman, as they would for many young men in America. In September 1939, Europe had been thrown into conflict when Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany in response. The conflict was threatening to become a global war from its inception, as Britain tried to have the United States intervene on its side. The US President, Franklin Roosevelt, was inclined to aid the British, but Congress was unwilling to get involved in what it deemed to be a European conflict throughout 1940 and 1941. But then on the 7th of December 1941, Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan, attacked the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Following this, the United States entered into the Second World War. Within weeks, young men like Herman Perry were receiving notices in the mail to inform them that they had been drafted into the US military. Herman was a rebellious figure who wasn't inclined to simply agree to what those in position of power told him to do. At first, he tried to ignore the notice he received and didn't show up at his draft board physical exam, but he was soon arrested for this infringement, and as it became clear to him, as to so many others, that Uncle Sam's call to arms wasn't optional, he attended the second draft board physical exam. Herman Perry was going to war, but no one, himself included, could have predicted how his wartime service would unfold. During the Second World War, African American men often served in segregated units, where they were commanded by white officers, many of whom were discriminatory and incompetent. Herman's particular unit was the 849th Engineer Aviation Battalion. It was composed of 750 black men, who were overseen by 50 white officers. It seemed that not even in war could the intolerance which had fueled much of society in the first half of the 20th century be abandoned. The 849th was soon sent off to the far end of the Pacific. This was the so-called China-Burma-India Theatre, a complex front which extended from eastern India all the way through Southeast Asia into China. Britain controlled India and had also controlled much of Southeast Asia prior to the war. However, the Japanese had taken control of much of China in the late 1930s, and by 1942 occupied virtually all of Southeast Asia. But by 1943, when Herman's unit was sent off to the China-Burma-India theatre, the British, with American aid, were beginning to mount a counter-offensive. As part of this, they were seeking to reinforce the Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists who controlled much of inland China and were fighting the Japanese. Herman's unit as an engineer battalion was assigned in 1943 to work on construction of the Lido Road, running from eastern India into the Yunnan province in southwestern China. The goal was to establish a decent road to allow for the resupply of the Chinese insurgents from British-held territory in India. Through late 1943 and into early 1944, Herman's unit toiled on the Lido Road, a piece of infrastructure which by the time it was finished would stretch 1,072 miles. This ran through a very inhospitable part of southern Asia. Herman and his fellow soldiers had to endure very warm temperatures, in which they dug out road foundations and broke down rocks to surface the road. The heat was punctured by monsoon rains, which turned the ground into a muddy quagmire. If this were not enough, Herman and his associates had to deal with leeches and mosquitoes, and the very real threat of contracting disease such as malaria and dysentery. Finally, bad food and an officer class, which often made the situation worse than it needed to be, only compounded the problem, and it was not long before morale amongst the 849th Battalion plummeted. But it was Herman Perry who would have the most striking response. By late 1943, Herman had become somewhat disillusioned by the conditions he was asked to operate in and the treatment he endured from the officers. When he refused to obey their orders, he was sentenced to a 90-day term in the military prison. This was a particularly dreadful environment. The latrines were overflowing, and the men were confined to leech and rat-infested cells. Moreover, Herman was made to stay there for 2 weeks longer than his assigned 90-day term. When he was finally released, in the early spring of 1944, he was determined that he was never going back. He also started smoking opium. Despite his determination to avoid being sent back to the military prison, Herman was soon in trouble again, and on the 5th of March 1944, he missed the morning roll call. Later that day, another commanding officer, Lieutenant Harold Caddy, attempted to arrest him and sent him back to the military prison. Herman, however, had other ideas. When Lieutenant Caddy approached him, Herman pulled his M1 caliber rifle and shouted, "Get back! Get back!" But while 3 soldiers, who were with Lieutenant Caddy in the jeep that had pulled up, remained where they were, the lieutenant continued to move towards Herman. As he did, Herman raised his rifle, took aim, and shot him in the stomach. Then, before the 3 soldiers in the jeep could react, he ran into the jungle nearby. Lieutenant Caddy died shortly afterwards from his wounds. What would Herman do now? He was a wanted man, in the middle of a jungle, in a country he did not know, and on the other side of the world from his home in America. By all accounts, he spent several days wandering the region, presumably wondering the exact same question. But then a few days after the incident, where he had murdered Lieutenant Caddy, he stumbled across a settlement. This one, though, was not an army camp, or anything of that kind. It was a village, with vines hanging around the outer perimeters, and on those vines were human skulls, some with water buffalo horns affixed to them. Herman had stumbled upon a Naga settlement. The Naga are people who are native to northeastern India, which today would be considered Myanmar, but which was then British-held Burma. In the mid-20th century, many Naga people were still living in the region, much as they had for thousands of years. They fashioned clothes out of cotton and animal pelts, hunted using spears and bows, and their societies were organised into tribes. Yet despite the cultural gulf between the young Herman Perry, who had previously been living in Washington DC, and the native Naga people, he managed to communicate with them by pointing and using body language, enough so that they took him in. He also gave them gifts, mainly goods that he had robbed from the military store back at the army camp, and by doing this, he won their trust. As a consequence, by the early summer of 1944, he was living amongst the Naga people, near the border between India and Burma. Meanwhile, though, back at the army camp, a manhunt had been organised to find the missing soldier and bring him to justice. Lieutenant Colonel Earl Owen Cullum had been appointed to apprehend Herman Perry. He was from Dallas and had been a police officer back in civilian life, so was ably suited to lead the search and investigation. In the weeks that followed, the lieutenant and his officers were gathering information, questioning the members of his battalion, and scouring the local area for any evidence of where Herman might have gone. Early on, however, the trail went cold. Some people believed that the missing soldier had probably been killed shortly after fleeing, devoured in the jungle by a tiger, or laid low by disease. In reality, he was actually gaining a position of some prominence in his new home with the Naga people. After being accepted into their tribe, he quickly managed to learn and communicate properly with them and won their trust. Over the 4 months that followed, he even married one of the tribe leader's daughters. It was a very strange development for an American GI amongst a people he had never even heard of a year earlier. But as Herman became more comfortable, he started making mistakes. By the summer, he had been spotted on several occasions by British officials, and word had got back to Lieutenant Cullum and the others investigating his disappearance. There were stories that a black American soldier was living amongst the local Naga people. It was a few weeks later that Herman was sitting in his hut in the village when he spotted a beam from a flashlight. Instantly knowing something was amiss, he made a run to try and get away, but a bullet tore into his chest as he tried to flee. Continuing his attempt to escape, he made it away from the village before collapsing. Shortly afterwards, he was apprehended and brought back to the army camp, where he was given medical attention. He was going to survive, but what would be his fate now? Herman was court-martialed in India in September 1944. The trial did not last long, just a few hours. He was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged. He did have the right to appeal though, and it was while this lengthy judicial process was occurring that incredibly he managed to escape yet again by using a set of wire cutters he had somehow obtained. It was now December 1944. This time the story of his escape became widely publicised. He even became known amongst the British press in India as a Jungle King. But the notoriety would be his undoing. The US Army Command now allocated huge resources to Lieutenant Cullum to track down the wanted soldier and bring him to justice. As a result, a massive manhunt occurred in the weeks that followed. Unsurprisingly, Herman was nearly apprehended on several occasions. On New Year's Day 1945, an army patrol came across him and even grazed his leg with a bullet, before once again he escaped. A similar near miss occurred weeks later, in February, when a bullet skinned his nose after he was spotted by US troops. The near misses and the constant pursuit were ultimately wearing Herman out. A few days after the incident where his nose was skimmed, some troops found him in a makeshift campsite that he had constructed himself. Herman didn't even run. When they arrived, he just said, "You got me." There was no escaping this time. He was to be executed. He was guarded very closely until the time came. It arrived on the 15th of March 1945, just over a year after he had shot and killed Lieutenant Caddy. When the day arrived, he was driven by a convoy of 17 military police to the gallows. There was extensive protection, as many believed that some soldiers from his battalion, who were so dissatisfied about their conditions and general treatment on the India-Burma front, would try to free him, despite the severity of his crime. Due to this concern, the military police had been given orders to shoot Herman if there was any attempt to stop justice being served. However, there was no such attempt to free him, and the sentence that had been passed in the previous September was finally carried out. Herman Perry's story has a lot of extraordinary elements to it, with the bizarre development of the American GI becoming an important figure amongst local people on the India-Burma border just months after stumbling upon them. But it did have a final twist. In 2003, Lieutenant Cullum, who was then still alive, received a letter from Herman's family, who wished to find out what had happened to their relative and where his remains were. They were able to determine that he had been buried in a military cemetery in Hawaii. Following this, Herman Perry's body was exhumed and the Jungle King was brought back to his family in Washington, D.C. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As you know, I always value your comments and feedback, so please leave any that you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case.